He was her boss, cold, distant, untouchable, until the snow trapped them, with no way out. Claire Sutton had rules. Keep it professional. Keep it polite. Keep your heart out of the office, especially when your boss is Grant Whitmore, the untouchable billionaire with a reputation as sharp as winter air. But rules don't matter when your car skids off a mountain road in a snowstorm, when you're dragged into a cabin with no heat, no signal, and no more distance between you. Suddenly, Claire wasn't just his assistant. She was the only person who saw the cracks in his silence, and he was the only man who noticed the sadness behind her smile. What would you do if the person you were told to fear turned out to be the only one who truly saw you? This is a story of quiet rooms, loud hearts, and a love that never asked for permission, of firelight, broken pasts, and the choice to stay when running would have been easier. If you believe in love that doesn't come easy, tell us in the comments. Now, take a breath and come with us into the storm. It was supposed to be a quick ride back to the city, but one wrong turn, one silent storm, and suddenly, Claire Sutton found herself trapped with the last man she ever expected, the man she worked for. The snow had started falling in lazy, soft flakes when they left Lake Placid just after lunch. Claire had wrapped her scarf twice around her neck and carried her notes from the morning's media summit tightly against her chest. She'd worn the wrong boots again. Thin-soled, stylish, but useless in weather like this. Grant had barely spoken since they got in the car. That wasn't unusual. He wasn't a man of many words, at least not with her. His voice was something people quoted in boardrooms, but rarely heard outside of them. Claire had grown used to the silence between them, not cold, just efficient. He drove the SUV with one hand on the wheel, his other hand resting loosely on the gearshift. The highway should have taken them straight back toward Albany, and from there, home to Manhattan. But visibility was dropping, and Grant, in a rare moment of hesitation, had taken an alternate route down a local road marked Scenic. Perhaps it once was. Now, it was just white. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, first a veil, then a wall. Trees blurred. The road narrowed. There was no shoulder, no signs, no other cars, just snow, thick and fast, and silence. Claire looked up from her phone, trying to get a signal. Nothing. She murmured, mostly to herself. Then the SUV jolted, a hard shift to the right. Grant swore under his breath and turned the wheel. But it was too late. The tires hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath a shallow curve. The world tilted. Claire gasped as the car slid sideways, then forward, then sideways again, and with a low, crunching groan, it tipped off the asphalt into a shallow slope lined with pines. Snow flew up against the windshield like a curtain. When they stopped moving, Claire's body felt suspended, like her nerves hadn't quite caught up. The engine sputtered, then died. Everything went still. Grant was already unclipping his seatbelt. "You okay?" he asked, looking at her. Claire nodded too quickly, then stopped, pressing her hand to her forehead. "I think so." "You hit something?" "No. I'm just dizzy." He didn't say anything more, just opened his door, stepped out, and immediately sank halfway up his calves in snow. She watched him circle the car, examining the undercarriage, the tires, the slope. When he returned to the driver's side, the look on his face was unreadable. As usual. "We're stuck," he said plainly. Claire stared at the dashboard. Her hands were starting to shake. "What do we do?" Grant tilted his head slightly, as if measuring her reaction. "There's an old cabin about a mile from here. My father built it. No one's used it in years, but it's solid. We'll go there. Wait this out." She nodded, trying to steady her breath. 1 mile. She could walk 1 mile. They gathered what they could coats. a flashlight from the glove box, Claire's tote bag with snacks from the hotel lounge. Grant locked the car, even though it felt absurd, out here in the middle of nowhere. Then they walked. The snow was knee-deep in places. It took them almost 40 minutes to reach the cabin. Claire stumbled once, then twice, and Grant caught her each time, not with softness, but certainty. His hands were large, steady, and didn't linger. By the time they reached the porch, Claire's cheeks were burning from the cold, and her fingers were stiff. She could barely feel the buttons on her coat. The cabin looked like something from an old postcard. Wooden beams, stone chimney, a sagging roof lined with icicles. The door creaked when Grant pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of dust, pine, and old smoke. There was no electricity, no hum of heat, only the brittle silence of a place that hadn't been touched in years. Grant moved with quiet purpose. He found dry wood in a stack beside the hearth and started a fire. Claire sat on a low bench, rubbing her hands together, watching the flames catch. Within 10 minutes, warmth began to seep into the room, not much, but enough to dull the ache in her bones. She watched him in the firelight, the way his jaw tightened when he focused, the way he moved without asking for help. She realized she'd never seen him like this, stripped of the tailored suits and boardroom confidence. He wasn't cold, he was contained, and something about that made her feel less alone. Grant brought her a heavy wool blanket from the loft upstairs. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She wrapped it around herself, trying not to shiver. "This place," she said softly. "Your father built it." Grant nodded, eyes on the fire. "We used to come up here every Christmas." She wanted to ask more, but something in his tone, quiet, not inviting, made her pause. Outside, the storm raged louder. Wind screamed through the trees, pressing against the windows like a warning. Inside, the fire crackled, and for now, that was all they had. By nightfall, the only light was fire, and the only warmth came from the man she thought had none left to give. They shared the same roof, but not the same silence. The cabin groaned softly in the wind, as if it too had just woken up after a long, forgotten sleep. Claire blinked slowly, her eyes dry, lips cracked from the cold air that still lingered in the corners of the room. She'd fallen asleep, curled in the blanket, one hand tucked beneath her chin, the other resting on her side like a child unsure of what world she'd wake into. The fire had died down to embers. Thin light filtered through the frost-lined window, pale and gray, a winter kind of morning. Her breath fogged slightly in the air, not freezing, but not warm either. When she sat up, her head spun gently, the kind of dizziness that came from a body still unsure if it was safe yet. She pressed her palm to her forehead, then looked around. Grant was already awake. He stood by the kitchen area, hunched slightly over a small propane stove he must have unearthed from somewhere in the back room. His shoulders, broad and straight in a thick sweater, moved rhythmically as he stirred something in a dented saucepan. He didn't look up when she stirred, didn't say good morning, but he hadn't left. Claire eased herself off the bench, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. The cabin felt larger this morning, not in size, but in space between them. They were sharing the same room, same roof, but everything else felt carefully partitioned. "Smells like oatmeal," she said quietly, offering a smile that didn't fully reach her eyes. Grant gave a small nod, eyes still focused on the saucepan. "Instant. Found it in the emergency kit. Not gourmet, but it'll do." There was something oddly humanizing in the way he said it. A billionaire man stirring old oatmeal in a half-forgotten cabin, wearing boots still dusted in snow. She'd seen him command a boardroom with fewer words than he used here, yet now, in the quiet of this place, even his silence seemed softer. He handed her a chipped ceramic mug, half full. The spoon inside clinked gently as she took it with both hands. "Thanks," she murmured, and meant it. They sat opposite each other, Claire on the bench, Grant on a wooden stool pulled from the corner. Between them, a worn table, an old rug, and the invisible barrier of roles they'd both rehearsed too long. She took a small bite, swallowed carefully. It was bland, thick, and oddly comforting. "Any word on your phone?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He shook his head. No signal, not even a flicker. They lapsed into silence again, but this time, not an easy one. It was the kind that made you acutely aware of every sound, the clink of spoon on ceramic, the wind rubbing against window panes, the slow crackle of a rekindled fire. Claire kept her eyes on her mug. "We're probably safe for now," he said at last. "Cabin's solid. I'll check the roof after breakfast, and there's more dry wood in the shed." She nodded, her fingers curled tighter around the mug. She wanted to say something, anything to pierce the quiet. But she didn't know what would be welcome, so instead, she stood. "I'll clean up," she offered. Grant didn't argue. He stood too, nodded once, and stepped toward the back hallway, disappearing into what used to be the sleeping loft. She heard a door creak softly, followed by the gentle thud of his footsteps overhead. Alone now, Claire took the mugs to the tiny sink. No running water. Of course. She used the bottle they'd brought from the car, carefully wiping the rim with a cloth. Every motion slow, measured, deliberate. She was trying to fill the silence with movement because words weren't working. After a while, she wandered toward the fireplace again, trying to keep the warmth on her back. Her eyes scanned the wooden mantel above the hearth, not searching, just idly observing. And then she saw it. A small photo frame, tucked between two books, warped by time and heat. The glass was cracked slightly in one corner. The image inside had faded, but still clear enough to make her stop breathing for a second. It was Grant, younger maybe in his early 30s, dressed in a flannel shirt, jeans, kneeling in the snow, and in his arms, bundled in a thick coat and a wool hat with bare ears, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 3. The way he looked at her, not at the camera, struck Claire with a force she wasn't prepared for. His face, so often impassive and controlled in the office, was utterly unguarded here. There was joy, real, open, unmistakable joy, the kind that came from nothing but love. Claire reached out and touched the edge of the frame, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She didn't know who the girl was, a niece, a goddaughter, or something else. The floor creaked behind her. She turned slowly to see Grant standing in the doorway, watching her. His eyes didn't flick to the photo. He already knew what she'd seen. Claire opened her mouth. Words hovered on the edge, but something in his expression, not angry, not cold, just distant, made her stop. She looked down at the photo again, then back at him. She began. Grant shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Some doors, even in a storm, stayed closed. She wanted to ask, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Some doors, even in a storm, stayed closed. Cold drives people close. But what happens when the heat comes from something more than fire? The snow hadn't let up. By late afternoon, the sky was still thick with clouds, and the wind whispered steadily through the trees like an old song no one remembered how to stop. The storm wasn't violent, just relentless, the kind that settled in and made itself at home. Inside the cabin, warmth was hard-earned. Claire sat near the fireplace, her legs folded beneath her, watching the flames curl upward as she rubbed her palms together. The heat had spread unevenly, chasing away the cold in patches. Her shoulders were still tense, her spine rigid despite the blanket wrapped around her. Across the room, Grant was sorting through a wooden chest in the corner. The lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing what looked like a stack of old quilts and folded flannel shirts, musty with the scent of cedar and years gone by. He pulled out 2 thick wool blankets, shaking off the dust gently. "Found these," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Claire nodded, grateful, though she didn't quite meet his eyes. "Thanks," she replied, her voice softer than she meant it to be. She stood to help him spread one of the blankets over the bench she'd been sitting on. Their hands brushed lightly, unintentionally, and neither of them moved. It was barely a touch, but it lingered, somehow. Claire glanced up, and for a second they looked at each other, not as boss and assistant, not as 2 people trapped by chance, but as man and woman, alone, cold, awake. Grant cleared his throat and turned away, folding the second blanket with more force than necessary. Claire busied herself with stacking more firewood beside the hearth, fingers trembling slightly, and not from the cold. The rest of the evening passed with an unspoken rhythm. They moved around each other in practiced silence, checking windows, sealing cracks with towels, boiling more water over the stove for tea. Survival had its own kind of intimacy, born not of choice, but necessity. At one point, Claire found a deck of old playing cards in a drawer. They played a few rounds of gin rummy at the table, her fingers still red from cold, his gaze unreadable behind the flickering candlelight. Neither of them spoke about the touch, or the photo, or the silence that wasn't just weather anymore. When night came, the temperature dropped sharply. They added more wood to the fire, closed the shutters tight, and layered every available blanket onto the mattress Grant had dragged down from the loft. It wasn't much, just a thin mattress from the old bed upstairs, now laid flat near the fire, but it was better than shivering apart in separate corners. Claire hesitated before lying down. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Grant was already sitting on the far side of the mattress, back resting against the wall, long legs stretched out. He nodded once. "I'm not going to let you freeze." The words were plain, but they carried more than warmth. She lay down slowly, facing the fire, her back toward him. The space between them was deliberate 6 inches of shared hesitation. She could hear his breathing, slow, controlled, but her own chest was tight. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that didn't feel too big for the room. Then she shifted, pulling the blanket higher. Her shoulder brushed his arm just slightly, and again. He didn't move away. Claire closed her eyes. Maybe it was the fire, maybe the quiet, maybe the loneliness she'd buried under emails and deadlines for too long. But something inside her was loosening, not in fear, but recognition. She wasn't used to this kind of stillness, this sense that someone was there without needing to take or explain or fix. Minutes passed. Then, in the dark, Grant spoke. "I shouldn't say this," he said, low and rough, "but I can't control myself around you." The words hit her like heat, not sudden, but spreading. Claire didn't turn over. She didn't reply. Her heart thudded beneath the blanket. There was no movement behind her, no expectation, just the confession, simple, direct, and stripped bare. She knew he didn't mean it the way people often did. It wasn't about desire or impulse. It was about something deeper. The way she softened his edges without trying. The way her presence disrupted the structure he had lived in for so long. Control was his armor, and she'd unknowingly walked past it. The fire crackled, sending a slow pop through the quiet. Outside, the wind continued its song. Claire didn't move, and neither did he. But something between them had already shifted. You think you know someone until they start telling the story they've never told anyone else. The storm had not yet ended, but it was quieter now, like a giant slowly falling asleep outside the cabin walls. The wind no longer screamed. It sighed. The snow still fell, but with less urgency. And inside, something else had shifted too. Claire sat on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in one of the heavy wool blankets, her hands cupped around a tin mug of tea. The fire still burned, though lower than before, casting slow-moving shadows across the wooden floor, across from her. Grant sat on the bench with one foot propped on a chair rung, arms folded loosely across his chest. He hadn't said anything since last night. Neither had she. But silence no longer felt like the distance it once was. It felt like space. Space for something to grow. Claire spoke first. "My ex-husband's name was Ryan," she said quietly, eyes on the fire. "We were married for 3 years. He was a musician, always had a guitar in his hand, and dreams in his head. I loved that about him. At first." Grant didn't interrupt. His gaze didn't waver. Claire's fingers tightened around the mug. "He didn't mean to let me carry everything. But somewhere between his studio sessions and my full-time job, I stopped writing, and he stopped noticing. Then my dad got sick. I moved back to take care of him. Ryan stayed in the city. By the time we realized we were living 2 separate lives, we just signed papers." There was no bitterness in her voice, just wait. Claire looked up, met his eyes for a moment, then continued. "I used to write children's stories. Nothing published, just ideas scribbled on receipts, margins of bills. I thought maybe someday I'd do something with them, but someday kept moving." She let out a breath, slow and shallow. "I think I stopped believing in happy endings a long time ago. Not because I don't want them, but because they always seem to cost too much." Grant didn't respond immediately. The fire crackled once, like it was waiting too. Then he leaned forward slightly. "My parents died in a plane crash when I was 23. Claire blinked. The shift in his voice was subtle, lower, tighter, but it struck her more than the words themselves. "It was a short trip," he went on. "Just a weekend getaway to Aspen. Private plane. Routine. My father had been flying for years. He trusted the pilot. They all did." He looked down at his hand. "I was in my 3rd year at Columbia. Just started an internship. I missed their last call. I figured I'd talk to them Monday." His jaw clenched, and his voice dropped. Monday never came. Claire didn't move, didn't speak. "I built the company after that." Grant continued, "Started with podcasts, then digital newsletters, then everything else. I didn't stop. Not once. Every time I felt grief trying to crawl in, I outworked it. I became the man people couldn't interrupt, couldn't get close to." Claire nodded slowly. "Control." Grant looked up. Their eyes met not in confrontation, but understanding. "I was supposed to get married once," he added, 3 years ago. She was good, kind, but she wanted the version of me that took days off, who left work at the door. That man didn't exist. There was a long pause. "She left," he said simply. Claire let that settle between them. No questions, no judgment, just quiet knowing. Grant shifted slightly on the bench, his hand resting against the rough wood beside him. "This cabin, my dad built it with his hands, every nail, every beam. When I was little, we'd come here every winter. No phones, no plans, just fires and stories and bad cocoa." He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "When they died, I didn't come back. Couldn't. It felt like stepping into a ghost." He exhaled, low and uneven. "But now, it's the only place I've felt like myself in years. Not a CEO, not someone to quote in press releases, just a man trying to stay warm." Claire's eyes softened. She looked around at the faded walls, the threadbare rug, the scent of pine and dust and memory. Then back at him. "Maybe that's all we ever are," she whispered, "people trying to stay warm." Neither of them spoke after that. There was nothing more that needed saying. Outside, the storm was fading. Inside, the silence was finally soft. Just when peace settles in, trouble knocks. It was mid-morning when the silence broke. Claire had just finished folding the last blanket near the hearth. The snow outside had slowed to a whisper, and for the first time in days, light poured through the windows, not in a dull gray, but in something close to gold. She could almost imagine warmth in it. She turned toward the door, ready to ask Grant if he wanted more tea, when a low rumble echoed in the distance. Not thunder, not wind. Engines. Claire stepped to the window and pulled back the curtain. Her breath caught. 2 snowmobiles, bright red and white, slicing through the clearing, kicking up plumes of powder behind them. And on one of them, even from a distance, she recognized the familiar dark coat and angular stance of Travis Hale. The knock came hard and fast. Grant was already at the door before she could move. He opened it wide, snow rushing in with the cold. Travis stepped in first, brushing flakes from his shoulders as if he were dusting off entitlement. 2 rescue team members followed behind him, their faces flushed from the ride. "Took us a while," Travis said. "Signal finally picked up your last ping." "Lucky for you." Claire stepped back, instinctively, her posture tightening. Travis's eyes landed on her a brief glance, sharp and assessing. "We're fine," Grant said, his tone neutral. Travis chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Well, that depends on how you define fine. You've been off the grid for 3 days. Whitmore Media's been a circus. Board's nervous. Investors are restless." Grant didn't flinch. "They'll survive." Travis's gaze flicked back to Claire. "This time, it lingered, you know," he said, casually. "Some folks in the office were curious. Assistant goes missing with the boss. Both drop off radar, snowstorm or not, makes for juicy stories." Claire stiffened. Grant's expression didn't change, not yet. One of the rescue team members approached, gesturing toward the snowmobiles. "We've got space for 2. If anyone wants to ride back now, we can take you." "Thank you," Grant said, eyes still locked on Travis. "We'll let you know." The man nodded and stepped back out, leaving the door ajar. Travis took a slow walk around the cabin, like he was inspecting something. He stopped at the mantel, picked up the photo of Grant with the child, and tilted his head. "Didn't know you still came here," he said. "Figured this place was part of your past." Grant's voice dropped a fraction. "You figured wrong." Travis turned back to Claire. "You must have made yourself pretty comfortable here." She looked away. He smiled, that kind of smile that knew exactly where to press. "I mean, what's a few snowy nights in the woods between an ambitious assistant and a lonely CEO? Right." The room chilled, despite the fire. Grant moved, not suddenly, but decisively. He stepped between Claire and Travis with a force that didn't require volume. His voice, when it came, was low and unmistakably sharp. "Don't you dare speak about her like that." Travis blinked. His smugness faltered. Grant's jaw was tight, his hands clenched loosely at his sides. For once, the restraint looked like it cost him something. "She's here because we were stranded," Grant said, his voice steady but burning. "She stayed calm. She helped. She didn't ask for any of this." He looked at Claire, not to check on her, but as if to say, "I see you. I believe you." Then he turned back to Travis. "And you," he added, "should be careful where you put your assumptions. They're showing." For a moment, no one moved. Only the sound of wind brushing against the windows filled the space. Travis finally cleared his throat, stepping back toward the door. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "I'll wait outside." The door closed behind him with a dull thud. Claire stood frozen. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but something inside her had curled in on itself. The old feeling of not belonging, of being questioned just for existing where she wasn't expected, came rushing back. She looked at Grant. He was still watching the door, chest rising and falling in quiet, controlled breaths. "I didn't mean to," she began. "You didn't do anything wrong," he cut in, gently. Still, she couldn't shake it. The look in Travis's eyes, the implication, the shift in the room. That night, while Grant was outside stacking wood, Claire quietly began to pack her things, what little she had. The borrowed sweater, the book she hadn't finished, the notebook where she'd started writing again, just a few lines. She wasn't angry. She was just tired of being someone's question mark. Claire started packing that night. She didn't want to be the cause of a war she never asked for. Leaving was the easy choice. Staying meant facing everything she feared. Claire folded the borrowed sweater with careful hands, as if gentleness could make the moment feel less final. Each crease she pressed along the sleeves was a quiet goodbye. She paused at the collar, smoothing it once, twice, before laying it neatly atop her packed tote. The cabin was silent except for the occasional groan of old wood settling into the cold. The fire had burned low. A thin coil of smoke curled up the stone chimney, and the light from outside was pale, not bright, but no longer threatening. The storm was over. She placed her notebook on top of the sweater, then hesitated. It had become her companion over the past few days, a place to catch fleeting thoughts, the beginnings of sentences, and emotions she hadn't planned to feel. Claire opened it briefly, fingers hovering over the most recent page. Then she flipped to a blank one, pulled the pen from her coat pocket, and began to write. She didn't draft it. She didn't reread, just a few lines. Honest, grateful. Thank you for warmth, and for not asking too much. You probably won't miss me, but I will remember you. She folded the note once and slid it beneath the rim of his mug on the small wooden table. It sat there like a whisper left behind. Grant was outside, stacking the last of the wood he and the rescue team had unloaded earlier. Claire could hear the dull thud of logs landing against the pile. His movements, always quiet but certain, had a rhythm she could almost predict now. She took one last look around the room. The cabin had been still and solemn when they arrived. But now, it carried echoes, the soft scrape of cards shuffled at night, the scent of tea, the distant murmur of their voices as they shared stories not meant for anyone else. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, pulled her scarf tighter, and stepped toward the door. Her boots met the floor with hesitant finality. She didn't expect him to stop her. She didn't think he would. And when she opened the door and stepped into the snow-packed morning light, he didn't. The cold was sharper than she remembered. It bit at her cheeks, stole her breath. She kept walking anyway, past the woodpile, past the edge of the clearing, into the silence of the forest. Her feet made soft crunches in the snow, a sound swallowed quickly by the pines around her. She found a fallen log and sat down, her legs aching more from what she was carrying inside than the walk itself. Then the tears came, not the loud kind, just a slow, steady unraveling like something long held together by habit had finally given way. She didn't sob, didn't bury her face in her hands. She simply let the ache move through her like wind. She wasn't crying for Grant, not entirely. She cried for the version of herself that always left before being left, the woman who folded sweaters too neatly, who never asked for more than she was offered, who smiled and nodded and made everyone else comfortable. She cried because, for once, someone had looked at her, truly looked, and hadn't tried to fix her or use her or pity her. He'd just seen her. And now she was walking away. Her breath hitched as she wiped her face with her scarf. She stood again, feet heavy, legs stiff, and turned in the direction of the rescue path. She took one step, then another. Then she stopped. It wasn't a dramatic halt, just stillness. The trees looked different now, less like a barrier, more like a veil. And beyond them, the cabin, small, weathered, waiting. She turned, walked slowly back through the clearing. Her pulse thudded in her ears. When she stepped out from the trees, Grant was still by the woodpile, back turned, placing the last few logs. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the look in his eyes, surprise, relief, a flicker of something he hadn't allowed before, met hers without needing words. She didn't speak, didn't explain. She let her bag fall softly by the porch and crossed the distance between them. When she reached him, she paused only for a second. Then, gently, she reached out and placed her hand on his chest, just above the place where his heart beat, steady and hidden beneath layers of sweater and silence. His breath caught. His hands remained at his sides, but his entire body stilled, not in resistance, but in something closer to surrender. Her eyes met his. She didn't say, "I changed my mind." She didn't whisper, "Please, let me stay." She didn't have to. The warmth under her hand was real. So was his stillness. So was the way his gaze softened, without dropping. It was the first time she had touched him, not by accident, not out of necessity, but by choice. And it was the first time in a very long time he had let someone in, not with words, but by not pulling away. A small movement, but everything shifted, and for the first time in years, Grant Whitmore let someone stay. Love doesn't begin with labels. It begins where masks fall. The first morning after Claire stayed felt different. Not because anything grand had happened, not because declarations were made or roles were rewritten in bold letters, but because, for the first time, no one reached for their armor, no clipped formalities, no careful distance, no Mr. Whitmore, no Ms. Sutton, just Grant and Claire, just two people sharing oatmeal and quiet. He made the coffee badly, the kind that scorched at the bottom of the old metal pot and tasted vaguely of smoke and regret. She laughed when she took the first sip, wrinkling her nose as she swallowed. "You sure you run a media empire?" she teased. He raised an eyebrow. "I delegate, clearly, for good reason." They sat by the fire on opposite ends of the same bench, each holding mismatched mugs, their knees nearly touching. Claire had tied her hair up in a loose bun, wisps falling down in the front. Grant's sweater had a small tear at the cuff. Everything felt imperfect in the most comforting way. Later that morning, they climbed onto the roof together, Grant first, then Claire with a bit more hesitation. The snow had started to melt in uneven patches, leaving behind damp shingles and small branches that had blown loose during the storm. Grant handed her a small rake, and they worked side by side, brushing debris off into the soft snow below. Every now and then, he would point out a spot where his father had repaired the roof years ago, places where the shingles didn't match, or where the nails were driven in slightly off-center. He always said the roof was like people, Grant said, his voice low. If it leaks a little, patch it up. If it leaks a lot, well, get up there and deal with it. Claire smiled. Sounds like a man who believed in second chances. Grant paused, then nodded. He did. When they climbed back down, cheeks pink from the cold and hands raw from the work, Claire pulled out 2 cans of something from the pantry. "Let's cook," she said, holding them up like prizes. He glanced at the labels. Beans and mystery meat, she shrugged. Gourmet. They managed to scramble some frozen eggs, burn the toast over the open flame, and boil water just long enough for weak tea. None of it tasted particularly good, but the sound of Claire's laughter as the egg stuck to the pan, or Grant's quiet grin when the toast fell into the fire, that was worth more than any perfect breakfast. And when the meal was done, bellies half full and hearts just a little lighter, Claire found a stack of old notebooks tucked into a drawer. She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through them. "These yours?" she asked. Grant looked up from where he was stoking the fire. His eyes softened when he saw the familiar leather binding. Yeah, a long time ago. She scanned a few lines, observations, half-finished essays, reflections written in neat, blocky handwriting. "You were good," she said simply. "Still are." He let out a small breath, half chuckle, half memory. "I haven't written anything since." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Claire glanced up, waiting. Since she left, he admitted. "My fiancé." After the breakup, words just didn't come. I thought maybe I'd written everything worth saying already, but none of it mattered anymore. So I stopped. Claire closed the notebook and looked at him, not with pity, but with recognition. And now he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. Carefully, without drama. He handed it to her. Claire opened it. A paragraph not long. Just a few sentences. Written last night. Ink still fresh. Not about her. Not about him. Just honest. "I hadn't written anything in 3 years," he said, voice low. Then he looked at her. Until now. The weight of the moment was not in its drama, but in its simplicity. No applause, no transformation. Just the quiet return of a voice. Claire folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "You should keep going." He nodded, eyes never leaving hers. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in long silver streaks down the trees. Inside, the light shifted just slightly, catching on dust motes that drifted through the air like thoughts. There was no need to say what it all meant. Sometimes healing doesn't sound like grand speeches or soft music. Sometimes healing sounds like laughter over burnt coffee and frozen eggs. The snow melted, but something stayed. Something warm. Something new. The rescue team returned 2 days after the storm ended, this time with a larger crew and proper snow-tracked vehicles. Claire stood by the cabin door, her bag already packed, not out of fear or doubt this time, but out of inevitability. Grant didn't say much that morning. He helped her close the shutters, folded the blankets they'd used, and stacked the remaining firewood against the outer wall like it still mattered. There was a quiet coordination between them now, not from habit, but from knowing how to move around each other. As the team loaded their things, Claire glanced back at the cabin one last time. The roof still bore traces of snow. The porch steps creaked under her boots. The fire inside had gone out hours ago, but she still felt its warmth on her skin. Or maybe it was something else. They rode side by side on the way down, bundled against the cold, the wind pulling at scarves and memories alike. Grant said nothing. Neither did she. But silence, now, didn't mean distance. It meant this isn't over. The city welcomed them back with noise the kind that pressed into your chest and made you forget how to breathe slowly. Horns, phones, elevators that dinged too loud, people talking fast, like every word had to compete for space. Claire walked into the office building Monday morning and paused at the lobby. The marble floors, once impressive, now felt sterile. Her heels echoed down the hallway like she was walking through someone else's life. She made it to her desk, sat down, opened her inbox. Deadlines, calendar invites, brand launches, pitch meetings. She stared at the screen, blinking. The cursor in one email pulsed like a heartbeat. Across the building, Grant was already in a meeting. She knew without asking, knew his routine better than her own, but something about it felt different now. He would sit at the head of the table, commanding attention with stillness, not noise. But maybe he'd be thinking of firewood, of burnt eggs, of the sound her laugh made when he ruined the coffee. By lunchtime, she was still on her first cup of tea. That's when the email came. From Grant Whitmore, subject nonebody, still can't stop. 3 words, no greeting, no signature, just that. Claire read it once, then again. Her hand hovered over the mouse. She didn't reply, not because she didn't want to, but because her chest tightened in a way she couldn't quite explain. Part ache, part flutter, part fear that if she said anything too soon, it would break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. She closed the laptop. A few days later, her manager called her into a corner office. Not Grant, someone else, someone higher up in HR. They smiled, explained how impressed everyone had been by her composure during the storm, how well she handled stress, how leadership material was written all over her. And then the offer came. Head of Content Strategy for the new regional division, more responsibility, better pay, her own office. Only one catch: it was in a different wing of the company. Different building, actually. Away from Grant, away from that strange, quiet corner of proximity that had become her second home. Claire nodded through the details. She asked smart questions, took the printed offer with both hands, thanked them sincerely. Then she walked back to her apartment that night, the folder still unopened in her bag. She made tea, took off her shoes, lit a small fire in the electric fireplace beneath her window, not because she needed heat, but because she needed memory. The flame flickered against the glass. She sat on the floor with her legs curled to one side, holding the offer in her lap. Pages filled with titles, expectations, clear steps upward. But all she could think about was the roof that didn't match. The notebook she'd forgotten to return, the sound of his voice in the cabin when he said he hadn't written in years until now. Claire set the folder aside. Her tea had gone cold. She leaned her head back against the wall and stared at the flame dancing in silence. Then she asked herself the one question she hadn't dared to face since returning: what do I really want? She stared at the offer, then looked at the fire crackling in her apartment, and asked herself, what do I really want? They say every love story deserves to be written. But what about the ones that rewrite you? The press conference was short, deliberate, just like the man delivering it. Grant stood behind a simple wooden podium, not flanked by executives, not wrapped in corporate gloss. Just him, in a gray sweater and slacks, with sleeves rolled slightly above his wrists. No tie, no teleprompter, only honesty. He cleared his throat. The room fell still. For years, he began, I believed the best stories were the ones we polished, the ones with strategy, branding, and a headline that hit just right. He paused, looked up. His voice softened. But lately, I've been thinking about the ones we don't tell. the ones we carry quietly, the ones that never made it past a kitchen table, a hospital bed, a winter storm. He took a breath. And so, effective next month, I'll be stepping down as CEO of Whitmore Media. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward, but Grant didn't flinch. Because I don't want to lead a company anymore. I want to build a space, one where people don't have to perform to be heard, one where stories aren't sold, but shared. Claire watched from the back row, her heart rising slowly like steam from a warm mug. 3 weeks later, the new studio opened. It wasn't glossy. A repurposed bookstore in the Flatiron District with creaky floorboards and tall windows that didn't quite seal in the warmth. But it had shelves, nooks, quiet corners where stories could sit down and exhale. They called it unwritten chapters. No one was quite sure what it was at first, a podcast, a community, a retreat. But slowly, it became all of that, and more. They invited people, ordinary ones, teachers, mechanics, widows, veterans, caregivers, teenagers who had seen too much, elderly couples who had lived through silence and still reached for each other's hands. No scripts, no interviews, just a microphone, a seat, and time. People came with trembling voices, with photo albums in their laps, with eyes that had practiced not being seen. They told stories of loss, joy, regret, survival, not to be fixed, not to impress, just to be heard. And something strange began to happen. Listeners cried and wrote in and shared their own untold chapters. The space filled with warmth that wasn't artificial, the kind built from raw honesty and quiet company. Claire handled much of the curation, helped prep guests, gently coached them when nerves rose. She always sat nearby, notebook in hand, present steady. She never needed to say much. Her kindness did the work for her. Grant, meanwhile, became quieter, not because he had less to say, but because he finally knew how to listen. He moved through the studio like someone who'd shed a skin, not smaller, just truer. One evening, just before closing, he found Claire in the small sound booth, organizing recordings. "Tomorrow," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "I want to tell a story." She looked up. "Yours?" she asked. "Careful." He shook his head. "Ours, but not with names." Claire's lips parted slightly. Her eyes searched his face. "You don't have to. I want to," he said. "It's time." The episode was recorded late that night. Just Grant, a mic, and Claire sitting quietly behind the glass, one hand resting on the table's edge. He didn't start with titles or weather reports. He began with a road, a wrong turn, a snowstorm that wasn't just outside, but inside. He described the cabin in soft, reverent tones, the firewood, the soup, the silence that eventually softened into something like belonging. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. He spoke of the way laughter cracked open the walls he'd built, the way someone unexpected, patient had reminded him that not all love begins loudly. He paused often, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the feelings were still that close. Through the glass, Claire listened, hands clasped in her lap. At one point, she blinked too quickly, wiping the corner of her eye with the back of her hand. And when he said, softly, she stayed. Her shoulders trembled not in pain, but in recognition. The recording ended. They didn't speak immediately. He stepped out of the booth, and she looked up at him, eyes still damp. "You rewrote it?" she said. "No," he replied. "You did." The episode went live that Friday. No marketing, no fanfare, just a simple title. Episode 16, Somewhere in the Snow. It spread quietly, like warmth in winter. Listeners wrote in by the hundreds. Some said it reminded them of someone they'd once known. Some said it gave them hope they didn't know they still had. A few said they were finally ready to speak to share their own stories. And somewhere not on a map, not tagged on socials, another cabin lit up. A fire was started, a roof patched, two hands found each other, and a chapter began, not perfect, not polished, but finally written. The episode ends, listeners cry, and somewhere deep in the forest, another cabin lights up. Years later, he still says it, and she still answers the same way. Winter came back quietly that year, the kind of winter that dusted rooftops like powdered sugar, turned every breath into a small cloud, and wrapped the city in a hush. Inside a modest brownstone near the edge of Flatiron, life went on without urgency. The world had shifted so much in 5 years, companies, platforms, headlines, people. But in this home, some things had stayed the same. Claire still brewed tea every morning at 6:30 sharp. Grant still took his coffee black in the same chipped mug with the faded skyline on the side. And Milo, their senior rescue dog, now a little slower on his feet, still greeted the morning sun by curling into a tight ball on the patch of light near the fireplace. They had no assistants now, no alarms, no urgent meetings, only rhythm and writing. Each morning, Claire wrote beside the fire, her notebook open, pen gliding slow and sure across the pages. Grant often sat by the kitchen window, tapping ideas into an old typewriter he'd fallen in love with at a flea market in Vermont. The keys clacked with imperfect music, no deadlines, no pitches, just stories, real ones, soft ones, forgotten ones, gently pulled from memory. They didn't ask the world to listen anymore. They simply made space for those who wanted to speak. Unwritten chapters had grown not explosively, but meaningfully. The bookstore-turned-studio had since added 2 more rooms, one for recording, one just for tea and quiet conversations. The shelves were lined with letters and photos from listeners, people who had felt seen for the first time, heard for the first time, or forgiven by someone they hadn't spoken to in decades. They never monetized pain. They didn't chase viral. They chased truth. And somehow the world responded. A retired trucker sent them his life story in cassette tapes. A widow sent the last love letter she wrote to a husband who'd passed away 30 years ago. Each one read gently, shared with reverence. Travis had moved on quietly. After a brief transition, he'd taken a role at another firm upstate. There were no public confrontations, no gossip columns. Only a message Grant received one spring morning. "Glad you found what you were really building toward." He never replied, but he smiled. Their apartment held no grandeur, just stories in motion. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and ink. Books leaned against vases. Milo's toys lay half-chewed under the table, and one corner of the living room always had Claire's soft shawl draped over it, the same one she wore the night they left the cabin. And yes, the cabin was still there. They returned each winter, never for long, just long enough to remind themselves of who they were without the world watching. It never changed much. The creaky steps, the fireplace that smoked if you weren't careful, the old photograph of Grant's father still resting on the mantel. It wasn't a symbol anymore. It was a place of peace, a page you never tore out. One December evening, as frost traced delicate veins across the windows, Grant stood in the kitchen, watching Claire as she reached for the tea tin on the highest shelf. Her fingers just barely grazed the edge before he stepped behind her, steadying her waist, pulling her just a little closer than necessary. She smiled without turning. His hand brushed her hip, then rested gently at the small of her back. "I still can't control myself around you," he murmured, voice deep and low. Claire paused, then turned slowly to face him, their eyes meeting in that timeless space where memory and presence folded into one. "Good," she whispered. "Don't." They had never married, not because they didn't believe in love, but because they had never needed a contract to stay. They stayed every day, through silent breakfasts and shared journals, through flu seasons and lost keys, through quiet Sundays when the city outside pressed fast and they chose to move slow. Their commitment was never loud, but it was deliberate. Claire once said, "Marriage is a word. This is a sentence." And it was, not a sentence to serve, but to live inside word by word, breath by breath. One rainy afternoon, as Milo lay snoring near the fire, Grant pulled an old manuscript from the shelf. It was Claire's. She hadn't touched it in years, not since the storm, not since she'd stopped trying to write for applause and started writing for herself. He read it slowly, letting each paragraph land. When she walked in from the kitchen, tea in hand, he looked up. "This is beautiful," he said. Claire blinked. "You think I know?" She sat beside him. They didn't speak again for a while, but later that night, she opened her laptop and began again, not to finish the book, but to enjoy the page. The world still rushed, but they didn't. They listened. To Rain on the Roof, to old vinyl records spinning low, to the sound of Milo's breath slowing at night, and to each other. Not every day was profound. Some were cluttered with groceries, leaky faucets, bills, but even those days had softness. Even the noise had grace. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, tentative flakes against the window pane. Claire lit a candle by the fire. Grant closed his notebook, stood behind her, and wrapped his arms around her waist. No words. Just warmth, and as the candlelight danced across the floor, they stood there, still, quiet, entirely present. They had built a life from ashes, not one they needed to perform, but one they chose every day. Not every story needs an ending. Some stories just keep burning like fire on a winter night. Sometimes life puts us in places we never planned, not to punish us, but to uncover what we've buried. Grant and Claire didn't fall in love in the glow of youth or the excitement of firsts. They found each other in the quiet aftermath of loss, in the stillness where ambition once stood. It wasn't the cabin that changed them. It was the silence, the forced stillness, the absence of noise that left room for truth. This story reminds us connection doesn't always come from big moments. It comes from showing up on ordinary mornings, from listening, from sitting quietly beside someone when words are too much. Sometimes, the bravest thing isn't falling in love, it's staying when it gets quiet, and choosing each other anyway. For those who think it's too late to start over, to heal, to be seen again, let this be your gentle reminder. Love doesn't have an age, and peace doesn't need perfection. It just needs space. So, if your life feels quiet now, don't fear the silence. That might just be where your next chapter begins. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Every click helps these quiet stories reach someone who might need them today. And your support keeps the light going, one soul, one story at a time.